Hey everyone, I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Writing Code That Stands the Test of Modern AppSec. Today's program is a live discussion, and you can ask a question at any point during the talk by locating the questions tab in your control panel, typing it in, submitting it, and we'll answer as many as time will allow. Also, we're recording today's session for viewing on demand at a later time. As we've been writing in SD Times, recent advances in technology and the coronavirus pandemic have put pressure on organizations to figure out how to work remotely while still being fast and secure. Some high-profile data breaches and service shutdowns recently have shown that securing your applications really starts with writing secure code. To talk about this in much greater detail are Tim Jarrett. He's a Senior Director of Product Management at Veracode, and Ray Bango, Senior Director of Developer Relations at Veracode as well. How you doing, guys?
Doing great.
Well,
Good, good. Glad to have you with us. So I know some developers who felt kind of whipsawed in 2020 with pressures to adjust to remote work and maintaining pace of delivery and innovation, but still being tasked with ensuring that their code is secure. So in talks that we've had, I know that you talk around three themes about this. One of them being automation and delivery, one of them being security as code, and how developers can write code based on knowledge in a modern AppSec world. So Tim, let me start with you. What role does automation play in helping developers deliver secure code? And maybe you can elaborate on that a bit.
yeah, no, it's a great question, David. I think that, first, it's important to recognize that automation is not just a security thing. In fact, it's kind of the context against which security now has to adjust. I think what happened a year ago when we all went into lockdown is that a lot of organizations realized that they had processes that relied on, their, being co-located, and then they were no longer able to be co-located. So a lot of people's digital transformation and DevOps journeys got kicked into higher gear as a result. And we've known for the past couple of years that as development teams adopt more automated ways of working and delivering software, that really shrinks the window of time for a security team to engage with that development group in a traditional way, in more of a hands-on, consultative review, non-automated kind of mode of interaction. And really what it means as more and more teams go in this direction is security has to figure out where does their function fit alongside those automated workflows. What of those workflows that they do can be automated in turn so that they get executed every time the team delivers software and there's no human interaction required, and where does the security team still need to interject into the process, but then how do they do that in a way that works with the development teams? So moving to emails rather than or to pull requests rather than emails as an example for kind of interacting with the team. So I think that when we talk about automation in the security context, we're really talking about the world, and then security has to make adjustments to live in that new world that we're all in.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, and I think that just adding to that, I think there's a cultural aspect of this, and there are a lot of companies that still are very traditional in the way they approach software development. As Tim said, they want to have people on premises. They want to have those interactions, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And a lot of people actually like that social interaction. I always go back to when I go into the office. That's my social hour. I work remotely. I've been working remotely for a long time, but not everybody likes that type of lifestyle. And so when you're dealing with remote and disparate teams, it can be a challenge to have everybody collaborate effectively. The one thing I will say is that video has actually kind of re-enabled that with COVID. It's not the same, but at least you have that feeling that you're there with your teammates, you can interact, but it is a very big cultural shift. And for companies who haven't embraced that early on, there has been a bit of a struggle with that. What I do appreciate is seeing companies that have evolved and taken the steps to enable their development crews to effectively collaborate, to leverage cloud-based technologies to manage their code bases, to leverage cloud-based systems and software as a service, to go ahead and continue doing things like security scanning and CI/CD, integration. All those things are now they're almost like readily available. It's like second nature to most developers. And the new breed of developers coming in, this is how they're going to be working in the future. They're going to be very much accustomed to this remote workforce type of scenario, but also when they come into the office, they're going to have the benefit of having people who have been there and done that for a long time, working in a collaborative nature. So it's a mixed blessing to some extent, because now you're giving people the opportunity to work wherever they can and wherever they feel they can be the most effective. And the other part of that I want to make sure that it's highlighted is that from a resource perspective, we have this gap of 3 million cybersecurity professionals. We need to fill that gap. And the remote workforce concept is going to allow companies to hire the very best people no matter where they live. And so instead of having to solely be in the office in order to get your work done, I guess to an extent, COVID has enabled companies to hire the very best and brightest wherever they live. And now the only thing you have to manage is time zone differences, which is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other things I know that you talk about is what you call security as code, which I guess means baking it right into the code as opposed to something that gets tacked on after the fact or first looked at after the application is completed. So how does that work? How much training do regular application developers need to get to a place where they can write secure code? Or are we talking about creating these squads that bring in security engineers as well to work side by side with developers? Tim, maybe can you address that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and let's unpack it a little bit. The first thing is, when we talk about security as code, we're really talking about making it so that the security workflows are managed and tracked just like every other piece of code associated with a project is. So, I think the first generation of, hooking security into somebody's pipeline looked like, oh, here's a new form that I fill out in the pipeline tool, be it Jenkins or one of the other original continuous integration tools, and now there's something that's security-wise that's happening in my project, and that's pretty cool. Except the problem is that it's now a piece of what makes your code go that lives in the pipeline tool, and it's not together with all of the rest of the code. And so the consequences of that are that it becomes hard to scale rolling out security, and it also means that the configuration isn't something that is easily reviewed and audited along with the rest of what's going on in the source code. And so as we make the shift toward kind of pipeline as configuration, which is what you see in the modern development tools. Jenkins now supports that, but also GitHub, GitLab, AWS, all the other modern CI tools define the workflow through a piece of code that gets saved in the repository. Security lives alongside and in those artifacts, so that they're under the control of the development team, that you can review the change history and version control. You can put a policy in place with pull request where you can require a security approver to review a pull request that makes a change to that workflow. And so we're really talking about taking advantage of processes that developers have used for a long time with managing their code and doing so in a mature way, and plugging security into those processes in the same way as well. And it really is a mind shift, because for some security folks it doesn't necessarily come naturally, but it means that you can leverage a lot more in automation, in workflow that developers are familiar with, and that starts to give you some scale. So when we talk about the term, that's how I think about it. And I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of other dimensions to it as well, like developer education, and we're disseminating some power to the developers. And Ray, I know that this is an area that you're especially passionate about in terms of how we get the developers ready to take on some of that responsibility.
Yeah, but and just to add on to what you're saying, I think that's such an interesting topic, especially when it comes to things like supply chain attacks. I think about what happened with SolarWinds and the fact that there was a bad actor that managed to get into probably the configuration code, perhaps in the CI/CD pipeline, that allowed these bad pieces of code to be injected into that supply chain. And so I can see the benefit of, having code as secure, secure. Oh my God, I just lost the term. I went blank.
Security is code.
Security as code. Sorry, I was thinking of something. You know what? You threw me off, Tim, because I was thinking of like security awareness for developers, because we were just talking about that. And so I could see the benefit of something like that. I think we need to. There has to be a more concerted effort to merge the demands of security with the development teams. And in fact, I was having a conversation with our researchers just this morning about how do we have conversations not only with the security practitioner and the security stakeholders, but also with the developers. And both of them, there's to some extent there's competing priorities for both groups. Obviously, security practitioners want to do their best to protect the most precious digital assets. I like to use that term. It's like that phrase is great. But I think it's perfect. They're trying to protect the infrastructure. They're trying to protect digital assets that are critical to the success of the company. But then you have developers, and developers have business needs, and they're having tremendous demands from senior leadership to say, we need to produce product, we need to have business continuity, we need to have new features that really differentiate us. So how do you bridge those conversations so that developers feel like their needs are met and they're heard, and that security also instills the values of security into the developers? And that's where I believe security champions come into play. I do believe having somebody or a group of people who can bridge those conversations between the two groups are a part of that whole plan and strategy to help developers and security practitioners have really good, thoughtful, and genuine conversations about best practices for securing code and also securing the infrastructure. Because the bottom line is that with this whole transition over to cloud, a lot of companies talk about, I want to go to the cloud, but ultimately, when you go to the cloud, what you're investing in is consistency and stability, and you're offloading some of the management of your normal network administration to a third-party vendor. And they generally do a good job if you set things up. If you embrace AWS or Microsoft Azure or GCP and you set those up right, those cloud infrastructures are going to be pretty solid. And what ends up happening is that the new endpoints that threat actors are going to look at are going to be your applications. And so that's why it's critically important that you have these conversations across the board to understand what is your threat model, what's your risk tolerance, where does things like compliance and DLP and all that come into play? Because with your application being that new endpoint, the one where these threat actors are going to be probing around, if you don't have the right policies in place and the right procedures in place to properly scan your application, especially for common vulnerabilities, which think about the OWASP top 10. What is the SQL injection? Has been in there for the last how many years? 10 years at least? 20? There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, I've written about that a bunch of times where these things just don't seem to move off the list. I noticed this year they kind of renamed a few of the items to make it look like the list is changing, but
No,
it's
the mistakes that people keep making, right?
Yeah, and the other part is you look at what's going on with bug bounty programs, and I'm actually amazed. And it's not so much that the value of bug bounty programs. That's not what I'm talking about here. It's what they're finding and how clever these people are. And so it's this ingenuity that the new breed of threat actor has in finding really, really unique vulnerabilities. And so having a good policy in place to properly assess your application and making sure you have good coding practices is going to be critical to protecting everything, the whole entire infrastructure, not just the application.
Yeah, and if I could tag on to that for a sec, I think that the fact that both of these are wrapped up in the concept of security as code, both the automation side and what you're doing with the people, is really important, because you can automate a lot of security concerns, but mostly the ones that are really widely prevalent and easy to address, right? Those are the ones that are great targets for automation. It's the ones that are more unique, more kind of special case, requiring a lot more security expertise, where automation isn't going to help as much. And that's where you really need to make sure that your security practitioner and the well-educated secure developers are focusing their attention on those instead of getting bogged down with the million SQL injections that are there, the million cross-site scripting things that are there. We can automate for that. We can kind of do what we can to address the balance of power, because you're right, an attacker will look for something that's easy to manage and that they can do at scale and that they can automate. If we can apply automation, that takes away one of the points of leverage that's traditionally been that source of asymmetry in the cybersecurity domain.
Yep. You think about what Chris Eng, our chief research officer, is constantly talking about, which is technical debt, and the fact that we have so many applications that are just sitting out there that really are not maintained anymore, or we just have code bases that we're just piling on top. That's all we're doing. We're just kind of like we're updating them, we're upgrading them, but upgrading simply means let's just add another layer on top of what's already under the hood. And it doesn't mean refactoring old code, it just means that we're just enhancing it. And enhancing is fine. I think enhancing, if you really look at what typically happens when you enhance code, the new code is adopting the new best practices. The old code continues to be old code, and that's where that low-hanging fruit comes in, and that's where a lot of these threat actors really capitalize on. And so if you ever do a CTF, like Hack the Box or Try Hack Me, and they give you a web app pen testing type of thing, you're going to find invariably there's going to be applications that are going to load up that the web interface has a vulnerability, a known vulnerability, because a developer left something open. And it's important to clarify that when a developer leaves something vulnerable, I don't consider that they made a mistake. They are ultimately, we're human, and we're doing our best to code what we can within the context that we know, within our skill set, and also within our timeframes. So I don't necessarily think they make a mistake. I think what's happening is we're fallible, and so sometimes things are going to be done to the best level, and that's where we need to complement it with other tools that help us solve those problems. So I say that because in too many occasions, I see companies that want to point the finger and say that developer was the cause of this or that administrator was the cause of this, and that's not the point of this. The point is, if you invest properly in your security strategy, one person shouldn't be the root cause for your whole entire company to get compromised. So there's a whole process involved there.
Right. Well, the other thing with vulnerabilities that I think is interesting, and perhaps developers are thinking this as well, I mean, if there's no path to get to that vulnerability, it's really not a risk, right? I mean, you have to be able to get to it to exploit it. But if there's no clear path to get to that vulnerability, maybe the determination has been made, well, we don't need to clean this up because there's really no risk there. I know a lot of security deals with levels of vulnerability and levels of risk. Perhaps that goes into some of that thinking.
Yeah, you have to prioritize ultimately, and you have to prioritize within the security vulnerabilities, and then as Ray was hinting at earlier, you have to prioritize against the other deliverables that the team is responsible for. And this is ultimately, I think, where some organizations get into trouble, because you can't always prioritize delivering the business value. You have to pay down some of that security debt sometimes. But it's perfectly reasonable to say we should fix the things first that we know have a path to exploitability, right? That's a very, very reasonable thing to do, and that's why kind of having tools that can support you in that prioritization decision can mean the difference between making some real progress in trying to pay down that security debt versus we tried to address some issues, we addressed some but not all of them. We don't know if we addressed the important ones, which is I think where some well-meaning organizations find themselves.
Yeah, I think it's important also to ensure that organizations don't practice security through obscurity. I think that's, when I was hearing you talk, I was like, oh, no, wait, hold on. I don't want security through obscurity, because just because something doesn't seem like it's available doesn't mean that there's not a path to it. One of my early instructors, he goes by Hacker Fantastic on Twitter. His famous mantra is, all computers are broken, and I firmly believe that. And so it's important to consider that, and we can't. I'm a big advocate of defense in depth. And so as long as you have layers, that's the approach that I believe that you should definitely be embracing, things like zero trust. And so your applications, yeah, let's make sure that we whittle down the technical debt. Let's make sure we evaluate all the security. That's the priority in my opinion. But again, that application should not be the thing that compromises your whole entire company. If that happens, then the failure is substantially bigger than just a simple code flaw. Then there's a whole infrastructure side that needs to be evaluated.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to draw the distinction between prioritizing vulnerabilities and like not fixing them. I joke with some of my colleagues that sometimes when we prioritize, we mean, priority 1, we got to do it. Priority 2, we probably are going to do it. Priority 3, we're not going to do it, right? And that's reality. At some point you run out of resources and time. But what you say is absolutely right. Just because a vulnerability, doesn't seem to be exploitable. Unfortunately, the reality is for certain classes of things like, known vulnerabilities in open source libraries, if it's a widespread enough library and it's attractive enough for an attacker, they'll figure out how to do some sort of reflection attack and do a little deserialization magic and call into parts of your code that you didn't think were exploitable, and then suddenly you're popped and it's all over, right? So, you don't ignore those, but it is a question of where you spend your time first, right? And that's the point that I think is important to take away.
Mhm. So as with many things that we're seeing in the world today, everybody's talking about shifting things left, whether it's testing, security, just putting more and more on developers and the development teams. So what would
I shift to the left when my back hurts, so I kind of shift over this way.
then everybody's just to the right, like the hokey pokey, right? Anyway, we digress. Yeah, so just wanted to ask about what a successful shift left security program might look like, and maybe you could elaborate more on some of the benefits. Obviously, catching it earlier, it costs less, it's easier to fix, and that, but perhaps there's more that we can look at, Tim, so I'll let you go on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it starts with some of the things we've already been talking about, right? It starts with automation. It starts with kind of looking even further left in the process to where the developers sit and helping them to understand, kind of what the good code looks like and arming them with what they need to know to address security issues that pop up. But I think that the real thing that we're seeing now that we're a couple of years into what we've been calling DevSecOps is that you want to get past the point where the miraculous thing isn't that it's happening at all, which is where we were for the first couple of years, right? Now we know that we can do DevSecOps. We can put, static scanning and software composition analysis in a pipeline. We can automate dynamic scanning and in staging and on the perimeter. All of these things can be done. Great. So now the goal is to make them so that they happen automatically and so that a development team doesn't have to devote an entire sprint or two to getting things stood up when they first get started, which is where I think a lot of teams lose traction and get stuck. So what I think good looks like from a shift left perspective now is not just we're executing scans and we're doing it in an automated way, but as a security team, we've given the development teams the tools that they need to kind of get started right away. That whether that and a lot of that is probably code. It's template things that you can drop into your YAML files for your continuous integration pipeline that call the right security tools and make things happen in the right way. It's a button you can push instead of a ticket that you file and waiting 3 days to get your team set up in a security system, right? So I think that that's really the place where we start to see people, being able to get to security nirvana is the security team in some ways goes through the same transformation that they have had to do on the regular security ops side of things in production, which is you know, the security team's responsibility is not to have somebody, you know, look at a ticket database and generate a new cert. The security team's job is to build a service that a developer can call to get a new cert, and, you know, get in the business of enabling teams, often through automation, so that their processes can happen seamlessly. So, you know, as I think about what I would tell a new team starting out now that's thinking about, you know, shifting left, yeah, I think we can start to take it for granted that, you know, teams understand that testing before, you know, earlier than the moment before you release is a good thing, right? I think people are starting to get that. And I'll say that just in case there's anyone on the call that hasn't heard it yet, if you give yourself more time and you do it earlier in the process, you increase the predictability of shipping software on time. You decrease the likelihood that you're going to need to seek an exception from the security team to go into production because you've missed your window to fix something, right? So it just makes good business sense to do all of that stuff. But I think that if you're going to do it at scale, then you really need to get to the point where you're thinking about how do you automate all those capabilities so the developers can consume it easily, and you know, and you become an enabler for them instead of a roadblock.
Yeah, I like to think about education as well in terms of shift left, and you know, thinking back of my history as a developer, security. I can't say security was always top of mind. There was always business goals, and that's one of the hard things for anybody who's not a security professional to understand. It's like we have business goals, and the security professionals are like, no, you need to. And so I think it's important to help developers understand how to properly remediate some of the things that they're seeing, not only at post, you know, CI/CD and getting scan results, but also at development time, trying to get them to learn what proper patterns are and what are the common things that could happen. And so, you know, like running an eval in JavaScript would probably be a bad thing. You know, those are things that you don't want to do. PHP, you don't want to run exec and have that open to the world. And those are just small patterns that should we do more to help educate developers in terms of best practices when it comes to security? Because then what we're doing is we're also minimizing the threat surface. We're minimizing the opportunities for threat actors as the code is being developed, and that complements the whole entire security scanning process, the CI/CD process. So shift left to me is certainly looking at things like what's your threat model, what's your risk, and all that stuff, and making sure that's taken into consideration. And then also bringing in security awareness and bringing in best practices and patterns that developers can embrace. And whether that's a documented practice at a company that they say, look, any new developers coming on board, you have to be onboarded, and not only in our development workflow practices, but you have to be also onboarded in terms of our security coding practices. I think if you do that, that's going to help mitigate a lot of the issues that are seen nowadays. And so I don't see that done a lot. I see a lot of great companies doing, having documents that talk about things like color charts and what's the best way to outline your CSS, and what's the proper way of, you know, what are the components that you can use for, I don't know, API integration. But what about helping the developers best understand how to properly secure their code? And I think that's another aspect of shift left that needs to be considered. And it just goes into the whole thing. And I know I'm kind of harping on this, but I worry about not having enough defenders out there. I'm a big proponent of this, and this is just something that I think is so important. We don't have enough defenders out there, and defenders to me are not just people who work in a security operations center as monitoring stuff. I think defenders are people who are obviously SOC analysts, and they're threat intel analysts, and they're blue teamers that set up network infrastructures and endpoint detection. But to me, coders are they're the blue teamers, because they're writing stuff. They're writing stuff to defend the networks, and we need to help them better understand that. We need to educate not only the current generation of developers. You know, listen, I'm an old fogey. I'll be gone soon enough, and out of the coding world, and I'm just going to try to impart some knowledge and wisdom on folks. But there's this whole great new generation of people coming out of college that are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and they're ready to take on coding challenges and do great work. And I hope that we could continue to educate them in some fashion to build really good, secure systems. So I think we need to start at the grassroots level, and that's the ultimate shift left. Start at the grassroots level in colleges, showing them how to best write secure code. Because let me tell you, all these folks coming out of college that are C++ experts that have never been taught how to properly secure C++ code, while I'm not one of those, I've seen enough bad C++ code and buffer overflows to know, yeah, that's a problem. So we need to have some good education there.
Yeah, I think that what is exciting about the hacker games that we're running right now for university students is that it is that kind of grassroots kind of exercise where we want to get university students excited about hacking, because we want them to understand kind of what the danger is, but also excited about fixing, and turning it into a competition is a fun thing. I also like the point that you make about spending the energy focusing on how you get after the issues and teaching the developers how to write secure code in the first place. I write code samples sometimes for what I do, and I write bad code samples. They work, but sometimes they have security issues in them, as my own tools will tell me. And I reached out to one of our security researchers and I said, how do I fix this? Because I'm coming across this issue in my code with log injection, and I want to figure out what I do to write better code there. And he said, I'll do you one better. Here's a drop-in library that we wrote that if you put it in your code in this way, will make all those issues go away. And I stopped and I thought about it, and I'm like, this is what shift left looks like for the security professional, right? Because you can spend a lot of time making people click through CBTs on secure coding practice, or you can give them a library and say, do it this way, and prevent the problem from being introduced in the first place. So I think yeah.
Oh my God, that's such a great point, Tim. And I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's like, think about all the folks that want to write their own cryptographic algorithms.
Do I have to?
I can count on one hand.
I'm like, wait a minute, why? You have these done. There's libraries that have been proven. Why would you want to write your own? And I'm like, it pains me, because if you want to do it because it's a pet project and you just want to learn cryptography and you want to be the next Bruce Schneier, okay, great. Hey, more power to you. Maybe you'll with the whole quantum computing thing, maybe you're going to come up with the next algorithm. That's awesome. But for right now, all you need to do is store passwords in a salted hash in your database. Well, bcrypt seems to work pretty darn good right now. Why rewrite why are you going to rewrite that from the get-go? Why it just doesn't. Anyways, you said it, and I was like, wait a minute.
You feel passionate about this or anything?
Yeah.
We can say.
So anyway.
Yeah, interesting point about getting college kids and people first coming into the field to learn these techniques, so that when they hit the ground running, when they get into jobs. I think a lot of problems that organizations run into is they're resource constrained, stretch really thin, need to go fast all the time. And a lot of organizations perhaps are looking at it and saying, I can't take a person off a project that he's working on to now train him up on how to deal with security practices. So I think the way that it's really going to work its way through is, again, seeding it in the educational process, and then having it just work its way through the professional ranks in that way. Very interesting. So one other question that I just wanted to ask you guys before we open it up to questions to our audience. If you want to ask a question, just type it into the control panel in the questions tab, and we'll answer them. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is about, as many people are talking about shifting left, you're also hearing now from the other side, people are like, no, you have to shift right. So that seems to be kind of a conundrum, or are they just being contrarian, or where's the value there? So Tim, what are your thoughts on it?
So some of it is a little bit contrarian, I'm sure, but there's some method behind the madness of which direction you shift, right? I think that when I hear somebody talking about shifting secure development, right, it's really in the spirit of doing what DevOps says to do, which is to create a feedback loop from what's happening in production into your process. And what that means is that the development team needs to be needs to have visibility into what's actually happening in production and be able to close the loop on when there are actually things that pop up that have some sort of security implication. So that means making better investments in security monitoring in ways that are not just in a specialized tool, but are actually in the log files that the dev team pulls up in Sumo, Logic, or whatever, and can actually see what's going on. If your application were proactively logging, for instance, for certain things that look like a SQL injection attack pattern, that might give you really quick early warnings that maybe there's something in the rest of your defense's depth that is failing and it's not doing what it should be doing. I think really, for me, a lot of it comes down to that. There's also an aspect of shifting right, which is about making sure that you get visibility into what's going on from an overall program perspective. That's not just like at a development team level, but once the code is in production, kind of what's the quality look like across the whole organization. So part of it is just that visibility aspect and helping the security team be able to do some governance on top of things and say, hey, maybe we need to crank down on the policy in this one area because we're seeing some real problems there, as an example. But primarily, I think it's just about kind of increasing the visibility on what's going on in production so teams can close the loop and respond to things that they see in the real world as the application's running.
Yeah, I like the analogy that Mark Bissell, our chief customer officer, uses. He likes to call it a catcher's mitt. And what he means by that is that you're doing a lot of legwork ahead of time, right? And you're making sure that you're still able to push code out and you're still able to be effective and the business continue to run. But you're also ensuring that as you go back, you're ensuring that you go back and you're constantly monitoring, and you're evaluating your application for changes that could happen that you didn't catch on the first go around. So yeah, the catcher's mitt approach, being a former catcher myself, I can kind of understand that, so it's kind of like just that backstop to protect yourself and make sure that you're constantly evaluating for new results. Things crop up all the time and you want to make sure you're ready for it, and the only way you can do that is by having some kind of constant monitoring of your assets, whether it's an application or whether it's your network infrastructure, whatever it is. But that's I like the catcher's mitt approach. Mark pretty much nailed it in that one.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you. I'm curious to know, how important is it to have a quote unquote security champion within development groups and within organizations, making sure that this is happening? Doesn't that kind of make it seem like, okay, he's the security guy, as opposed to having it be more of a team effort or what have you? So what is the role of a champion and how important is it?
Ray, do you want to start on this one and I can follow in?
Yeah.
Or
No, I'd be happy to. So the way I kind of look at security champion is somebody who can bridge the communication between both groups. This is not a person who is the end all be all in terms of security decision making. It's just that you have two very different groups, and most of the times these groups have different priorities. By having a security champion, you're hoping that that person can help to bridge the communication and help to kind of manage the priority setting between the two. Sometimes you need somebody who can just be the Google Translate between the two organizations, and that's what I see them. They're not going to be the final decision maker. At least that's not the way I look at it. I don't think they're going to make the final decision what security means or what's going to go in or not. They're there to help bridge conversations, and it's really important to have that skill. That's one of the things you have to be able to have good relationships with your peers and be able to talk effectively, so that, because what you don't want is two conflicting groups. Otherwise you're blocked, and hopefully this person can kind of break those blocks and push stuff going forward.
Yeah, I think the way that security champions comes in is that if you want to go into the theory of it, your security team is a constraint in classic DevOps. It's a scarce resource that knows a lot, but that can't scale across all the development teams. So you have to find ways to elevate them to only pull them in when they're needed. And one of the strategies for doing that is security champions. You train up a developer in basic security principles so that they can answer a lot of questions for the team. Maybe over time they're performing code reviews with a security eye, or they're offering the team advice on how to fix certain categories of security flaws. And they know enough to know what they don't know so they can raise their hand and pull the security team in when they're needed. And that's really, fundamentally what it comes down to is, as you say, Ray, it's absolutely a bridge. But it's a bridge with the specific goal of increasing the reach of the security team so that the development teams can be more self-sufficient. It's kind of the same thing that's happened with people with skills in containerization or Kubernetes or other, kind of formerly, island off skills that were the responsibility of a centralized ops team historically. In DevOps, you pull those responsibilities into the team, and you increase the number of people that can go full stack. Well, security champion is somebody who can go full stack all the way through to the attacker potentially. So,
Right. So just getting back to the point you were making about training earlier, a question would be, Veracode, I know you guys have your security labs. So what do they do? What is that work, and how do people, how would they access that?
yeah, so from a product perspective, security labs is a way more hands-on way of learning about securing applications. It's instead of computer-based videos, it's real code running in a virtual machine, and it's a set of steps that teach you how to find the security problem in that working code and actually exploit it, which is kind of cool if you've never actually had a chance to get hands-on and do it. And then how to go into the code editor, which is also part of the product, and fix the code and restart the application and then see that the problem has been fixed. It's a hands-on way of doing that education across probably 20 or 25 different coding topics in a bunch of modern languages, and it's designed to gamify. When we first got the product in, which was at the beginning of lockdown, and I didn't have a whole lot else to do, I got myself to the top of our internal leaderboard on it because I was like, this is fun. I want to keep doing this. And that's what we want, every developer to have the experience with it as well. And there's a community edition. So, if a developer wants to get some education and wants to get started with some of the fundamentals, that's actually out there for free.
Great, awesome. All right, looks like we're coming up on time, so I would just throw it out to you guys for some final thoughts, and perhaps, if there's one key thing you would like attendees to take away from this today, I'd love to know what that is. So Tim, I guess we'll start with you, and then Ray, we'll hear from you.
Sure. I think that the one thing that we want to, kind of take away from today's talk is that the game now is not necessarily showing that you can do security as part of continuous integration. The game is how can we do that across lots of applications in our portfolio and automate the way that security plugs into the process. That's the trick, and to do it requires you to invest in models that allow you to do templates to really practice security as code. For getting security plugged into the process, and to invest in your people to look at how you actually can make security champions in your development organization. You can address bits and pieces of the security puzzle without those two things, but if you really want to do them at scale, those need to be somewhere on your radar. Ray, do you want to tag on there?
Yeah, for me, the big thing I guess I kind of want to leave everybody with is that it's important to continuously look for new opportunities to learn best practices when you're talking about secure coding. It's not an easy thing. I'm not saying that secure coding is easy. There's challenges. Things evolve, and we as professionals we have to evolve with it. But it's also important that whatever you learn, share it out in the community. Take the time to educate your peers. Point them to things like security labs so that at least they get a foundation in terms of secure coding practices, and they understand what something bad could potentially look like. Sometimes it's there are people who learn differently. my wife, for example, is a visual learner. She likes to see things, and that's how she groks it. And so some people need to have the hands-on approach. And so it might be worthwhile to build security awareness programs or brown bags where you can sit with your colleagues and walk through things that you normally wouldn't, especially when it comes to security. And so take advantage of the resources out there for AppSec so that you can build a better program in your own business.
Great. All right. Well, certainly want to thank Tim Jarrett, Ray Bango today for joining us. A great talk, gentlemen. Really informative and helpful. Thanks so much. I'd also like to thank Veracode for sponsoring today's event, making this possible. And certainly I would like to thank all of our attendees who hung in there with us today to hear all about this. And we thank them for joining us. So until next time, again, I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. So long for now.